I didn't make $900,000 because I was smarter than my neighbor. I didn't make it because I won some lawsuit either. I made it because a very rich man looked at something that belonged to me, decided it would look better if he owned it, and convinced himself I was too old, too quiet, and too ordinary to stop him. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 63 years old, retired from 37 years as a utility systems engineer, and until this happened, the most exciting part of my week was arguing with sheep that somehow always found new ways to escape a perfectly good fence. I live outside Pendleton, Oregon, on a piece of land that's been in my family since my grandfather came back from World War II. 180 acres of rolling pasture, a weathered farmhouse, a red equipment barn that leans just enough to make visitors nervous, and fence lines that carry more family history than most people realize. My grandfather built those fences himself. Cedar posts cut by hand, stretched wire, countless weekends of labor. Every section meant something to him. When he died, my father maintained them. When my father died, I took over. Across the eastern boundary sits a house that honestly doesn't even look real. The place belongs to Victor Langston, a retired software founder who sold his company for more money than I can even picture. His estate looks like something you'd find in a luxury architecture magazine. Glass walls, imported stone, sculptures that probably cost more than my pickup truck. At night, the entire place glows like a spaceship landed in a cattle field. Victor and his wife, Serena, moved in about 4 years ago. We weren't enemies exactly. We just existed in different universes. I'd wave for my tractor. Sometimes he'd nod. Most times he wouldn't. That was fine by me. I wasn't looking for friendship. Then one Tuesday morning, everything changed. I was checking a fence section after a windstorm when I noticed something strange from a distance. At first I thought sunlight was reflecting off a vehicle. Then I got closer, and my stomach dropped. About 200 feet of my grandfather's cedar fence was gone. Completely gone. In its place stood enormous glass panels, crystal clear, nearly 10 feet tall, running along the property line like some luxury resort installation. I actually stood there for a minute trying to understand what I was looking at. Then I noticed a white envelope attached to my gate with a plastic zip tie. That's when things got weird. I opened it expecting maybe an explanation. Maybe a contractor's note. Instead I found an invoice. A real invoice. Heavy paper. Fancy lettering. Professional formatting. At the top it read Scenic Boundary Improvement Project. Below that was a balance due. $15,000. According to the paperwork, I was apparently responsible for paying part of the cost because the new installation had enhanced the visual appeal of my property. I laughed. I honestly laughed out loud because for a few seconds my brain refused to accept that another adult human being had actually done this. Then the laughter disappeared. Someone had removed my fence. Someone had entered my land. Someone had replaced family property with something I never requested. Then they had the nerve to send me a bill. I drove straight back to the house and called my attorney, Greg Wallace. Greg had handled property issues for ranchers around Eastern Oregon longer than I've owned a cell phone. After listening quietly for several minutes, he surprised me. He didn't say much about the fence. Instead, he asked a strange question. Daniel, where do their utilities come from? I remember staring at the kitchen wall. What do you mean? Power, water, communications, anything crossing your property. I told him I wasn't sure. He said, find out before you do anything else. The next morning, I drove to the county office. Then I visited the utility district. Then I started digging through records. By lunch, I found something interesting. By dinner, I found something incredible. Every major service feeding the Langston estate crossed my property. Electrical transmission, water supply, fiber internet, backup propane infrastructure. Everything. The farther I dug, the stranger it became. There were maps, old references, engineering notes, historic routing documents. But one thing was missing. The one thing that should have existed if everything was legal. There was no recorded easement. No permanent access agreement. No registered utility corridor. Nothing. Apparently 30 years earlier, the previous owners had worked out a friendly handshake arrangement. Back then, everyone knew everybody. Nobody expected problems. Nobody filed proper paperwork. And now, decades later, that oversight had become the most expensive mistake Victor Langston had ever made. I sat at my kitchen table long after midnight looking at those records while rain tapped against the windows. For the first time since finding that ridiculous invoice, I wasn't angry anymore. I was curious. because suddenly this wasn't a story about a fence. It was becoming a story about what happens when someone mistakes kindness for weakness, and Victor Langston was about to learn the difference. The next morning I called a licensed surveyor and told him I needed answers, not estimates. By noon he was walking the eastern boundary with GPS equipment that probably cost more than my first house. I followed behind carrying coffee and trying not to get my hopes up. Around 3 that afternoon he looked up from his tablet and said, "Well, you've got a problem." Then he smiled. "Actually, your neighbor has a problem. The glass wall wasn't sitting on the property line. It wasn't even close. In several places it crossed onto my land by nearly 5 inches. That may not sound like much to some people, but property law doesn't care whether it's 5 inches or 50 feet. Crossing the line is crossing the line." I thanked him, got the report, and drove home. That evening Greg came over. We sat on the porch while the sun dropped behind the hills and turned the pasture gold. He reviewed the survey, reviewed the utility records, and finally leaned back in his chair. "Daniel," he said, "if these records are accurate, your neighbor just picked a fight with the wrong retired engineer." Day 2 started with certified letters. One went directly to Victor Langston. Another went to his attorney. A third went to the property management company overseeing his estate. The letter was simple. Remove the encroaching structures. Compensate me for damages. Negotiate a formal utility agreement. You have 72 hours to respond. Failure to do so will result in revocation of access permissions and initiation of all available legal remedies. I wasn't bluffing. Neither was Greg. The interesting thing about wealthy people is that many of them spend so much time winning that they eventually assume consequences are something that only happen to other people. Apparently Victor was one of those people. 48 hours passed. Nothing. No phone call. No email. No apology. Not even an acknowledgement that the letter existed. Then on the third day my phone rang. Victor himself. I could hear confidence dripping from his voice before he even finished saying hello. "Daniel, I reviewed your little letter." "Little letter?" That's how he started the conversation. "Good," I said. "Then you understand the situation." He laughed. Actually laughed. "No, I understand that you're overreacting. The fence was an improvement. Property values increase when views improve. You're making a mistake turning this into something bigger." I remember looking out my kitchen window toward the pasture while he talked. Sheep were grazing peacefully. A hawk was circling overhead. Meanwhile, a grown man worth tens of millions was explaining why I should be grateful he removed my property. "Victor," I interrupted, "do you know where your power line comes from?" Silence. Just for a second. Then he said, "What does that have to do with anything?" "Everything," I replied. Another pause. Longer this time. "You'll be hearing from my attorneys," he finally said. "That's fine," I answered. "But unless something changes, you may be hearing from your electrician too." Then I hung up. For the first time, I think he realized there was information he didn't have. Day 4 was where things started moving fast. Greg advised me to prepare for enforcement. Not because we wanted conflict, but because preparation changes negotiations. So I hired an excavation company to identify and expose portions of the utility corridor crossing my land. Completely legal, completely documented, completely professional. The owner of the excavation company, a guy named Earl, showed up before sunrise. He looked over the paperwork and whistled. "You know these folks aren't going to like this." "I don't imagine they will," I said. "Good," Earl replied. "Because I already don't." News traveled quickly. Less than an hour after crews started marking routes, my phone exploded with calls. First came Victor's attorney, then his property manager, then another attorney. Suddenly, everyone wanted to talk. Funny how that works. Nobody had time for conversation when they thought they were in control. Now everyone wanted urgency. One lawyer actually suggested I was harassing his client. I nearly choked on my coffee. "Your client tore down my fence," I said, then sent me a bill. He didn't have much to say after that. By the end of the day, they were threatening injunctions, lawsuits, damages, delays, investigations, everything they could think of. Greg remained calm through all of it. "Threats are free," he told me. "Court orders cost money." On day 5, they went to court seeking emergency relief. The hearing wasn't dramatic like television. No surprise witnesses. No screaming attorneys. Just facts. Documents. Records. Survey maps. Utility histories. Ownership boundaries. The judge reviewed everything. Asked questions. Listened carefully. Then came the decision. Request denied. No injunction. No emergency protection. Property rights remained intact. I'll never forget walking out of that courthouse. Greg didn't celebrate. He simply smiled and said, "Now they understand the board they're playing on." He was right. Because that evening the tone changed completely. Gone was the arrogance. Gone were the lectures about property values and aesthetics. In their place came concern. Real concern. See, people often imagine wealth as freedom. Sometimes it is. But wealth can also become dependency. The bigger your lifestyle becomes, the more infrastructure supports it. Victor's estate wasn't just a house. It was an ecosystem. Security systems, climate controls, heated flooring, water pumps, data networks, smart home automation, backup systems feeding backup systems. Every luxury depended on utility access. Utility access that crossed land he didn't control. On day 6 there was a knock at my door. I already knew who it was before opening it. Victor stood on my porch wearing an expensive outdoor vest that somehow made him look even more uncomfortable. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked his age. Maybe older. Gone was the polished confidence. Gone was the executive swagger. He looked tired. We sat at the kitchen table where my grandfather used to drink coffee every morning before sunrise. Victor glanced around the room. Family photographs. Old wood floors. A house built by people who repaired things instead of replacing them. "Daniel," he began carefully, "there has to be a reasonable solution." Funny thing about that sentence. Reasonable solutions usually arrive before legal threats, not after. I slid a folder across the table. He opened it. His eyes moved line by line. Then he stopped. Then he read it again. Inside was a proposed 50-year utility easement agreement. Permanent legal access. Fully documented. Fully protected. Cost, $850,000. Annual corridor maintenance contribution, $24,000. Fence reconstruction using premium old-growth cedar matching historical appearance, $48,000. Reimbursement for legal expenses, surveying, consulting fees, and property damages. Total package, just over $900,000. Victor stared at the page for so long I thought maybe he hadn't heard me speaking. Finally he looked up. $900,000? A little less than what rebuilding your infrastructure elsewhere would cost, I replied. Actually quite a bit less. His jaw tightened. That's outrageous. I nodded toward the folder. Then there's the alternative. The alternative wasn't a threat. It was math. New utility routing would require neighboring approvals. 3 adjoining landowners had already declined preliminary inquiries years earlier, according to county records. Environmental review would take months. Permits could take longer. Construction costs were estimated in the millions. Service interruptions were likely. Delays were almost guaranteed. Wealthy people understand leverage when they see numbers. Victor saw the numbers. He knew I wasn't inventing them. He knew his attorneys had probably shown him the same projections. The room stayed quiet for several seconds. Then I added one final condition. The cedar fence gets rebuilt exactly the way it was. He looked at me. It's just a fence. I shook my head. That's why you're sitting here, and I'm sitting here. To you it was just a fence. To me it was family. For the first time during that entire conversation, he didn't have an answer. He simply lowered his eyes back to the paperwork while the old kitchen clock ticked on the wall between us. Victor left my house that afternoon without signing anything. And if you'd asked me then how it was going to end, I honestly wouldn't have known. Part of me expected another round of lawyers. Another round of threats. Maybe months of legal maneuvering. But something had changed during that conversation. For the first time, he had been forced to look at the situation from a position he wasn't used to occupying. He wasn't the man with all the leverage anymore. He was the man asking permission. The following weekend was strangely quiet. No phone calls. No angry letters. No construction crews. Just the usual sounds of ranch life. Wind moving through the grass. Sheep complaining about absolutely nothing. The occasional pickup rolling down the county road. Then on Monday morning, just after 8, my bank called. At first I thought it was routine fraud verification. Instead, the representative asked if I was expecting a large incoming wire transfer. When she told me the amount, I nearly dropped my coffee mug. The agreement had been accepted. The money had arrived. Just like that, months of potential conflict ended with a single transaction. But the money wasn't actually the part that satisfied me most. What happened next mattered more. Within days, crews arrived to remove every section of glass that had been installed along the boundary. Watching those panels come down felt strangely symbolic. For weeks they had stood there like monuments to someone else's entitlement. Now they disappeared piece by piece, loaded onto trucks, and hauled away. After that came the fence reconstruction. Not a cheap substitute. Not modern materials. Real cedar. Skilled craftsmen. Traditional construction methods. The project ended up costing significantly more than the original estimate because matching the historic appearance required specialty lumber and custom fabrication. I visited the site nearly every day. Sometimes I'd stand there quietly and run my hand across the new cedar posts. They smelled exactly like the fence my grandfather built decades earlier. That scent brought back memories I hadn't thought about in years. Summer afternoons carrying tools behind my father. Listening to stories about hard winters. Learning that ownership isn't really about possession. It's about stewardship. You're simply taking care of something until it's someone else's turn. A week later, another envelope arrived at my house. This one wasn't attached to a gate. It was delivered properly. Inside was a formal written apology signed by Victor. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't poetic. But it was sincere enough. He acknowledged the property violation, accepted responsibility for the unauthorized construction, and agreed to the terms of the settlement. I read it once and filed it away. Some people would probably frame the apology. I framed something else. That original $15,000 invoice. The one they had zip-tied to my gate. The one demanding payment for destroying my fence. Today it hangs on the wall above my coffee station. Every morning I see it while making breakfast. Friends who visit always ask about it. When they do, I usually smile and tell them it's the most expensive bill anyone ever sent me. Looking back, the whole thing taught me something important. This was never really about wealth. I've known rich people who were generous and respectful. I've known working-class people who treated others terribly. Money wasn't the issue. Entitlement was. Victor became so accustomed to getting what he wanted that he stopped asking whether it belonged to someone else first. Somewhere along the way, he convinced himself that a better view justified crossing a line. The problem is that property lines aren't just marks on a survey map. Sometimes they're boundaries between respect and arrogance. Between neighbors and adversaries. Between doing things the right way and assuming consequences don't apply to you. To his credit, after everything was over, Victor changed. We never became friends. But we became something better than enemies. A few months after the settlement, I was repairing a gate near the road when he stopped his truck and got out. We talked for nearly 20 minutes. Nothing dramatic. Weather, cattle prices, local politics, normal neighbor stuff. Before leaving, he glanced toward the rebuilt cedar fence and said, "It does look better than the glass." I laughed. "Told you." He shook his head and laughed too. Then he climbed back into his truck and drove away. That's probably the closest thing to a happy ending real life usually offers. Nobody rode into the sunset. Nobody delivered some movie-style speech. A mistake was made. A lesson was learned. A fence was rebuilt. Life moved forward. But I'll admit, every now and then, when I'm pouring coffee beneath that framed invoice, I still get a little satisfaction from remembering how a man tried to charge me $15,000 for taking down my fence and ended up paying more than $900,000 to put it back. Now here's what I'd really like to know from all of you watching. Was I justified in pushing as hard as I did? Or should I have accepted a smaller deal and moved on? Have you ever had a neighbor, an HOA, a developer, or somebody with money and influence try to bully you into giving up something that was rightfully yours? Drop your story down in the comments. I'm genuinely curious where you stand on this one, because even now people around town still argue about whether I protected my property or taught a lesson that cost far more than it needed to.